I will start by saying a few things to try to see if I can address kind of what seems to be a general thread, and I'd like to make 2 points, I think. So the first one, it seems, and this came out partly also in discussion during the break, is that this view that I can hold myself out of the sexual act at will, yes, or that I can somehow sometimes be in it and sometimes be out, does very strongly what underlies that is this body-soul disconnection. So somehow, instead of a union between body and soul, we're really advocating then that there's this kind of disconnection. What seems very strange to me, and what would be my response in the culture in particular, is that it seems to me that on all other levels of activity and appetite, we're so hyper-conscious of the union nowadays, you know, where I'm so conscious of what I eat because I think it will somehow affect me, or I'm so conscious about how I exercise in my Zen time because somehow it's going to affect my deeper self. Do you know? And so it seems to me that it's that precisely what's so beneficial about Hildebrand is that he begins with the nature of the sexual act itself, and he tries to show, I mean, that is even different in the realm of all acts. That, and he, I think, makes some very solid, good points that one would have to return to, and one could make more examples, but somehow precisely that, well, if there's such a close body-soul connection in all of these others, so somehow they affect me. And then, particularly, and also taking into consideration the other points that were made, here we're not just talking about one body and one soul, but 2 bodies and 2 souls, yeah, in the union, in the sexual act, that would seem significant, and we can't simply do away with that. And then the other thing that I think Hildebrand, at least what we've been hearing, one of the things from Hildebrand that I'd like to bring up is, you know, he always has an issue with this sense of man viewing this kind of freedom in terms of control, like this hyper, super control, you know, so that somehow freedom is defined by the fact that I can control things. And his whole point is, in fact, there are many things that we cannot control, and that's why we cooperate with them. And we have to cooperate with them in good ways. So, you know, we've been talking about the heart and affectivity and how there are just many things it's simply given, and then even in a very valuable way, so then it's that gift character. And the point is not to, like, we don't have that control over ourselves to that degree, yeah? And so somehow we seem to want to maintain that in the sexual act and in the sexual sphere. And then yet, I mean, think about everything else. I can't even control when I get sick or when I get tired or when I have a head. I mean, like, all of those things, somehow now I don't have, do you see, this control even over just my body, let alone the connection between my soul and my body. So it would just seem, I think, that, to me, it would seem that Hildebrand would encourage us, as a start at least, I mean, to look at, you know, this this idea of freedom and that controlling that we have. How much can we really control these things? But then also really at this union, I mean, between soul and body, but particularly in the sexual act, where that's not to say, remember, or maybe a third point, remember how Hildebrand rejects beginning with the perversion of things. Like he says, you know, because then you discard it, or then you have a false understanding of the thing itself. Though it is true that even in the perversion we can learn something about the true nature of the thing, yeah? But I mean, that he would want to start at precisely a positive point somehow, in the sense of how sex can, or how it can be that it is the only way to express this, regardless of whether it is always an expression of this, regardless of whether it, you know, I mean, we could imagine very well if somebody's been a prostitute, or they've been sold into prostitution, you know, for 30 years, this has been their life. I mean, this is, you know, he would not deny that perversion then has somehow caused such an obscuration even of the self, or such a, I mean, there's been you know, that we're not talking about the full blossoming of that sort of revelation of the intimate self that can happen in a spousal act in the proper context when precisely it is ennobled by love. Do you see? So I mean, these seem to be, to me at least, distinctions that would be helpful to make. But we have another hand, and then I know that on this side I'll get plenty more deeper insight, richer insight. It will come in just a moment. But let me take these two questions. Yes.
Okay. a little bit to see the real consequences. If you listen to the people that do those things that go to bed, when they stop and they look forward, you usually understand that there's a big problem right there. They tell you something is taken from my heart. A little bit of my heart was taken in each of those relationships, even though I don't want to I don't want to that happen, you see?
Mm-hmm.
And they feel empty. That's the word they use. And empty.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe you have to wait a little bit to see real consequences involving the heart,
Mm-hmm.
even though they think they're controlling the situation.
Mm-hmm. So it's not like eating refried Twinkie bars and then immediately blowing up and seeing the consequence physiologically, but one would have to somehow wait. No, but I mean, I think that there is a lot of truth to that. So in the sense that, you know, there's certainly value, and there's value also to, and Hildebrand would acknowledge that there can certainly be a blindness. You know, Hildebrand talks much about that blindness. It's not to say that just because someone doesn't recognize it, it isn't happening, you know. And then the question is, are there moments in their experience that we can then point to and say, but see, now at least you see something of what I'm trying to get at. So, I mean, we have to take that into consideration, I think, as well. Yes.
Well, building on that, I was just going to wonder if, in dialoguing with the culture, if the question isn't, I think the arguments kind of fall flat because they're already value blind, and the question you need to ask is, how do we show them the value of the person? They're not just, you know, and the other person and in themselves, because if they're blind to that, most of these arguments just, they kind of fall flat because they don't already see the value. I mean, it seems like the arguments kind of presuppose that you already see the value. If you don't see the value, I don't know how do you reach the person?
Aristotle would very much agree with you, because Aristotle in the Nicomachean Ethics has that very, very like powerful passage where he says, and you get some of that also in Hildebrand. John Crosby mentioned that the other day, I think, where he says that, you know, once you're talking to somebody who's immoral, then they won't hear what you're saying. Like, they will not be receptive to it. And we find that very often in that discussion also on contraceptives. If you have a room full of people who are contracepting, then there's an inability to receive anything. Like, there's just sort of this, and so that sets us up, of course. It seems then incredibly pessimistic and very dark. As I mentioned the other day, Aristotle's solution is begin with the young. And I think that's a very hopeful thing, yeah? And then I think that Hildebrand, what I appreciate about his axis is that he does still try to appeal to, maybe the entirety of the experience won't be open, but maybe even if it's just the one or the other aspect that might capture the audience's attention, you know, where they, maybe even if there's just one in a list of 20 points that you could make about sex, that somehow, oh yeah, okay, I can see a difference there. But, you know, I mean, it would be a very slow process, and it would be very, very difficult. So I would agree, and I think that Hildebrand would agree that, you know, that fundamental attitude, that fundamental being open to receiving the truth about value certainly has to be there. And that is something that no discussion and dialogue, no matter how good you can put the master John Crosby in the room with the person, that will still not affect, you know, an ability of the person to understand what you're saying. So youth might be, very young, might be one way to go. We should all become elementary teachers. Forget college. High school. No, I'm just joking. Yes.
So I'd say to that, it's, you know, there is kind of this element of like Aristotelian habituation into like a false perception of reality, and I think kind of what we've been talking about, especially beginning with Christopher's kind of Thomistic language of subject-object, subject-subject. It's just a notion of objective truth. And if someone doesn't have like an awareness or a willingness to recognize the truth as an object outside of themselves as a subject, not that it doesn't have a subjective element, then that's what makes the conversation kind of fall flat, fall on deaf ears. And so maybe a I mean, like we were talking about when we were discussing the affections, maybe like an aesthetic perspective could be helpful. And if we can kind of indicate to people that there's a greater beauty that they're missing out on somehow, that will get their attention, because people want that. People long for that. They want beauty. They want goodness. And even if it's not a situation where they're able to understand these arguments from a truth standpoint, that an argument from a beautiful standpoint, that there's a greater, more rich, beautiful, joyful experience that they're missing out on, could be a doorway into that. And in discussing, like, you know, withholding the self, and is it possible to withhold the self, even in the sexual act, I would kind of go back to this objective argument. Whether or not they know the objective realities of what they're doing doesn't negate the objective realities of what's happening. And if I think there's an opportunity there, not just to the negative but to the positive, to discuss grace and, you know, the restorative value of grace in terms of what is objective and what is objectively happening. And if it all can kind of be discussed through a lens of beauty and through the aesthetic, I think that maybe it will get people's attention a little bit more.
Mm-hmm. I mean, it is, of course, at least on a theoretical level, people can be just as blind to beauty even then, or that can be a very difficult. But what I appreciate, maybe something that John Henry Newman would say, is that, you know, that beauty, especially through the real lived experience of it. Like, there is something where, again, you know, I think that there is a value to sometimes, you know, and this is a very, I think, unique call, where it's maybe not so much to even, maybe the philosophical arguments will break down, but it seems a particular call then to the individuals who are open, who are susceptible, who understand this beauty, then to live it in a beautiful and joyful way, and that is then the captivation, you know, or that somehow we can captivate them and bring them back into a kind of a philosophical, and then deepen that philosophically. That I would certainly appreciate and agree with.
Right.
I think.
And you hear discussion of, like, the example of the married relationship on display, kind of pointing to the relationship between God and man, and this kind of redemptive example. Professor Frederica said something a couple days ago that I think applies to this when he discussed the lived experience of the marital relationship being a freeing, because of the kind of commitment of the will, it having a certain freedom attached to it that enables the energy for perseverance in the relationship and a deepening of love, is something that is very difficult to communicate outside of experience. And so, you know, maybe that's all we have. Maybe all we have is examples of really Christ-centered relationships being put on display, and, you know, in building relationships with others, to put these things in their minds, yes, in an aesthetic kind of sense, but also in an experiential kind of way.
Mm-hmm. Being the philosopher that I am, I like to think that that's not the only thing we have, and that we have to use reason as well. But yes, no, I think that is actually, it comes down to being the most powerful, perhaps, voice that we have, and that, especially when we live our philosophy, that was, of course, brought up the other evening, that has to be there. You know, we live our belief, we live our religion. I mean, otherwise, it's of course all unconvincing. So yes.
With regard to the negative, objective realities that happen, say for casual sex, some terms were used, like there's a depletion that goes on, there's an emptiness, and I'm just wondering, like, what is the nature of the heart that it can be squandered, and is there something essential that is depleted, or is it maybe wounded? It seems to me that there's something essential to every human person, whether they're a prostitute or whatever, that can never be depleted or squandered. It can never be emptied. There's a certain intrinsic dignity. But is maybe wounding the heart a better term? Or is the heart something that can be squandered and yet still not be emptied? I don't know. I'm just wondering sort of the nature of what happens to the heart and the consequences.
Mm-hmm. So thank you for bringing us back to that earlier question. Would you like to give that a go? Should
I think that I don't really have much to add. I think that's a very good point, that this wandering is a complete self-loss, there's a wounded self that remains. And so we'll be talking about the wounded person who throws him or herself away in completely uncommitted sex. Would be better. Or one concept, I really like Anna's comment there about the negative effects that show up eventually. In my experience, there's a deep loss of self-respect that arises in a person who habitually has sex without any marrow. That particularly conspicuous in women, in my experience, but that loss of self-respect is just what you expect. Hildebrand has it right about throwing oneself, squandering oneself, dissipating oneself, but remaining, like Henry says, as a wounded self. But that, and self-respect is a highly prized thing in our culture, so maybe there's a way to move up with that and get a hearing for responsible.
I mean, Hildebrand at one point, I'm trying to remember now in which of the several chapters that we read, so that we never lose ourselves completely, that's impossible, which of course is the optimism, because then we can always, but that there is a way, there's another way in which we can speak of a kind of a self-loss or wounding where we've surrendered something important of ourselves, or we've somehow lost possession of it, we've given it away, and that there is that need to recapture that, there is that need to sort of regain that. And so it would seem to me that, we always try to be very careful when we talk to people, and of course, if somebody's been doing this over a long time, and I think that also maybe to something that you had said, the burden of the challenge is really on us, right? Because we have to come up with the examples that will really be gripping, that really come close to home, and it may be different for one person than it is for another person, And we have to be attentive to the language, and we have to be attentive to saying things in a distinguished enough way that people can understand without sort of taking that offensive. But there is certainly that, that emptiness also that can happen where one can see the difference between a person like that and then a person who just simply lives the fullness of themselves and who hasn't somehow lost possession of themselves, And so, for example, to an addict, like a heroin addict, it's not to say that they're no longer themselves at all anymore, but certainly we would agree in that case that they're not fully themselves, like they've lost something very essential. So we see it in those very extreme situations, and even with sexuality, and in a different way, because it is very different than in the addiction to heroin. There's something, Hildebrand talks about at one point that it's more perverting in a very profound way, but again different than if we have other abuses. Does that answer somewhat what?
Well, Anne and I were talking there with Greg about maybe the difference being, virginity is something that is lost, but purity being that overarching value, and maybe that sense of loss, or because purity has also been lost in that moment, but purity can also be sort of regained and reformed in a person. And I think, going back to also how we reach out to people who are amidst this culture that just hasn't even been raised on this kind of sensibility to this. I think the reason beauty is so attractive, and in some ways to me too, is because it offers a kind of healing. Like beauty can be very healing for people, and I think they have been hurt in a very, very deeply personal way, and so the truth that's being offered, from our perspective, I think is a very sort of neutral truth, and it's good. But for them, that truth involves accepting a lot of personal pain, and so I think it almost has to be offered from healing and then truth and then healing, and healing has to be, and healing and hope, I think, to give, because when I talk to people about the fact that maybe a sense of innocence can be hope of being able to reclaim something seems to light up something inside people, because I think they almost start to despair.
Now, I really I like this from the aspect also of now from Hildebrand's, because I find that especially among women that sort of feeling impure, right? Feeling that and I think that Hildebrand has something very hopeful here to say, because purity is, because he defines it in terms of our relation to values, not just to, but and not to the past in some sense. You see, so that and impure, so that there's that virtue that can exist, where one doesn't have to recapture the past or somehow make it undone, because of course it's impossible. And then there's a kind of a hopelessness that comes with that. And of course, from our experience, we're talking about, I think, a different kind of purity here. But if we can reorient it, if we can speak about or give the message of, the kind of virtue of purity in the Hildebrandian sense, then that would be just simply a way to go from this moment forward also, and the way to have that, I think, new beginning without having that past hanging over so drastically, as it can be if we understand purity in a different way, as something, as that innocence that can't be recaptured, or, so I don't know, maybe it's just simply a thought from, yes, Anna.
It was highlighted yesterday about how on the proper side of the sexual relationship, in a sense where you still have to be aware of, say, in a marriage, the wife not giving her complete self in the sense that she loses sight of her own value. And so that understanding of having to perceive your own value, the preciousness of your own gift, is important in order to be able to actually give that gift. Mm-hmm. Because if you don't know what you're giving, you don't realize, you lose sight of the actual value of the gift itself. Mm-hmm. And so whenever a person has that feeling of emptiness, that they have that realization of what they've given without themselves actually realizing it. Mm-hmm. Then there's what an aspect of hope is now they are aware and they need to regain their sense of their self-value. Mm-hmm. In order to be able to give that beautiful self-value gift, that beautiful gift that you now appreciate. And now it ends up being that future is inherently, you'll be able to perceive the beauty in that you did not perceive before.
I think that's very beautifully said. And very much in line with everything that Hildebrand has been saying thus far, where, that appropriate relation, or that appropriate understanding of who we are, that precedes, of course, and that appropriate understanding of love, that somehow does precede any deeper understanding than also of, and that sex is used so often, isn't it, because of that lack of the lack of self-respect not only coming after sex has been abused, but already preceding that, because then, or that lack of self-esteem, because we seek to be loved, we desire. At one point, I remember being struck very much by John Paul II when he said, we desire love more than we desire freedom. And then so he makes this very interesting case where he says, freedom is freedom for the good, so freedom is for the sake of love. Where he has this very interesting, very powerful kind of message to the youth, but simply how and I think that's the power also of Hildebrand, how he really has, he gives us a tool to speak to people again in a deeper way about love, not just him, obviously many others, but that really is so central, because in love, that proper understanding of self and of the other, of course, is required. I like that a lot. Yeah. Yes. Sorry. Catherine, right?
There's another, bringing in that this is all our body and our soul combined, and looking at other fields of study. So, we were talking about statistics earlier, showing how people later on in life they are affected by these things, even if they don't realize it. And I think, honestly, a lot of people don't ever fully comprehend how they were affected. But in my work in abstinence, there's been this study that it's in its infancy. It's not been well formed, and so I don't like to use it as proof. But there has been some evidence to show that when we have these sexual relationships with people, and we have them like frequently with different partners, there's the chemical process in our body. That's why in the abstinence program we use the tape example a lot, because when you reuse a piece of tape, it loses bonding power. And a lot of people don't like that because then they're like, well, there's no room for redemption in there. But that's a whole, it's a piece of tape. It's an example. But there is some. It's an analogy, and all analogies are imperfect. But the idea is that when these I forget which hormone it is in our body, but the constant misuse of it, and this is where we can show from an outside of philosophy, proving or kind of showing people how it can affect us in more objective, concrete form. Our physical bodies are telling us that there's something wrong with this, because when you do it so often with different people, we then lose our ability, when we find that person that we love, to really bond with them. We've lost that ability to, well, until we have, through whether it's counseling or, so we can regain it, but there's a damage there that we've done to ourselves physically that prevents us from truly having that bond with one person in love.
But it would seem not just physical, because you could speak of the physical being very intriguing, if the statistics indicate that. But that, simply on the level of a person, that it becomes very difficult to bond, or we withhold something of ourselves, and it's far harder to really,
it's that
to
crossover
give that.
of neuropsychology where it's it's not just it's the biological process that is happening because of our actions, and it affects our psychology.
Or you could say that it's the soul that is manifesting itself even physically, like somehow how what's happening on the level of the soul even has an actual concrete physiological manifestation. If there's that connection that's so deep, then which happens first? Is it on the level of the soul, or is it on? So just simply saying that philosophically, that could be a very interesting. That is a very interesting point as well. Did you want to add something to that?
I was just going to say that, this kind of was about, there's oxytocin. Right?
Sorry, I didn't hear. What?
Oxytocin.
Ah.
I was going to say this as we were talking about abstinence programs. What would Hildebrand say about about loving the beloved before you even know the beloved? Having that projection, in the sense, you don't know who or she is, but because of love, you're saving the sex, and you're saving yourself. Because for me, we were talking about in the secular world, it's so hard to argue the truth, but I think sometimes we take a very negative attitude towards it, almost like we lose some sense of hope, and that's wrong as well, because we're told to. Truth has a way of coming out on its own as long as you speak it. And I know for me, in a secular institution, I think one of the things that attracts people the most just by nature is love. And we have such different connotations of it, such different definitions, that if we brought that out, the nature of love would be the best way to speak to people about purity. And I know as a teenager, what struck me the most about chastity was there was these speakers, Jason and Christina, and how they say waiting for that loved one, and I think that's a really good argument. What do you guys say?
What would Hildebrand say? I feel like you're more qualified to sit in the chair of Dietrich von Hildebrand. It would seem to me somehow that maybe the beloved, it has to be, to love the beloved, you would have to have some kind of person. You could withhold yourself. Do you know what I'm saying? Certainly the value to save yourself, but that you have this kind of love or this cherishing already of the beloved, that seems very, very theoretical, at least to me. I don't know that somehow for him it is so crucial to have an actual person.
Could I say
yes.
something that might move in the direction of it? Something I was really struck when we read chapter 2 of the Heart is at the very end of that chapter he talks about poetic feelings, where there is this kind of longing, and it's not really developed there, but he says there are these poetic feelings, and I don't know if that could speak to a kind of longing that one might have for a beloved one hasn't met yet.
Yeah, I also think it's much more than theoretical for that reason. There is, I think, maybe especially in women, a excuse me, I'm giving my insensitive nature away every time I open my mouth. But there is this deep longing to be married or to find someone, and so to appeal to that and say, so when that moment comes, you want to be ready. You want to be. You want to be able to give a beautiful gift. You want also to be sort of worthy of the choice. You want to be picked from all other women and so on. So I think it is I would agree that it is a very powerful, persuasive argument for people that one reason you don't want to sleep around is because you really want to be able to give something. I think also historically and so on, it has sort of always been part of the motivation for saving your virginity if you want. So, and I think Hildebrand would fully agree with that. He just would say, obviously, it can't be a love for a specific spouse. I mean, that's clear. But the longing for love has a very strong, I think, psychological power.
Hildebrand somewhere speaks about this idea of God having chosen someone for you. I forget where I read this recently this week, that you have this sense of knowing when you meet this person. And I was thinking about that because if you look in the scriptures, like in the book of Tobit, I don't know if you remember the story of Tobit where Tobias is with the angel, and the angel is telling him about Sarah and that God has destined this woman for him. And he falls in love with her. He's not met her yet. He has this experience of falling deeply in love, it says. And I just, I wonder how Hildebrand would then answer that or say that when God has because God calls all of us to vocation, has a plan for us, and somehow he enables us to intuit that or know it, and that we can experience in our heart that being fulfilled, or we hear of it, or when you just see someone.
That's very interesting. Well, there you go. I think those were much better answers than I tried to get. Let's see. There are two more questions. Really quickly, do you feel, I don't know if this is going more into the direction of, abstinence and sort of the talks for abstinence. Do you feel as though we have fully and satisfactorily addressed how we would address our society, but also the text itself of purity, or just because we're coming now even just to the close of the morning session without having had a second presentation. And so, for the sake, yes, Kevin, there's a question.
Could I add something to that conversation?
To this conversation?
Yeah.
Okay.
Or
Are there any
one?
other? Yeah, that's fine. Let's just try maybe in a few more. We'll wrap it up and we'll bring this to a close. I just want to make sure that you're aware of we're reaching the end of our time. So if there are more questions about, also specifically about the text, then you should certainly feel free to raise them. But Jesse had his hand up before you, Kevin.
Well,
so.
I was going to say two things. One is she said exactly what I was going to say about predestined, sort of beloved. But the second thing, I remember I read an article in Dr. Crosby's ethics class 7 years ago or something like that, and it was by Elizabeth Anscombe, and it sort of opened my mind to what Aristotle meant by Eudaimonian ethics, like the ethics of happiness. And I think that some of the examples given up there I've noticed as a student or as a teacher as well that over the years, as my students' behavior has gotten seemingly worse and worse in regard to sexuality, there's just been this explosion of like mental illness. Students having to say I had to go to the hospital for 3 days and stuff like that. Like, I think that without a doubt, like we can see objectively speaking that this sort of behavior is destroying us, you know. And a long time ago, I taught high school, and there was this kind of thing. I joke about it probably inappropriately, but like my students would out of nowhere, my high school students would develop ADD out of nowhere, and then their parents would be like, oh, I don't know, they have this sort of disorder shown up out of nowhere. Oh, by the way, we just got divorced, or something like that. And so I think there is absolutely, we can look at, even as she was saying up there, like scientifically, like that this is not something that is good for us. It's not conducive to our happiness at all. And I think that can be one of the most powerful arguments, is presenting the view that this is, scientifically speaking, very destructive.
Yeah, very interesting. I mean, that this relation between soul and body, that we become more somehow need to focus on that maybe more. Sister, were you going to respond directly to Jesse?
Because that argument you can use, but if you're dealing with students like at college level, they're not going to follow that argument unless you have all of the proof. And the problem is that many of those, you have to find the studies. We need more studies on that. Different scientific evidence has been brought up in different relations this morning to different points. We need more scientific evidence because that's what they're also looking for. And they don't go for it if it's just a Catholic argument, or some Catholic study. We know that's true, but we do need more studies to factually found it for people usually to respond to that argument.
Kevin, you had your hand up, yes.
So in terms of engaging the culture, I was thinking about how von Hildebrand places chastity under the broader virtue of purity. So that maybe one way is to try to, at a more foundational level, is just to try to awaken people to value around them. That there's this tendency in our consumer culture that everything is has the same value. You're going through our economic crisis, go out and consume something. It doesn't matter what you're consuming. It could be pornography, it could be a rosary. Just go out and consume. It's all the same. That just to awaken someone to value at a foundational level could be a good thing. And he also mentions here the possibility of, or the possible role that beauty could have in awakening people to see sexual value.
I mean, I appreciate that from the sense of, I do think that we can't, again, coming from the philosophical background, I mean, I have a very deep sense in which, just awakening thought. My greatest success experience as a teacher, I just need to tell you this because it was quite humorous, for my first semester teaching, and I was really just encouraging the students, talk to each other, dialogue, and I made it a requirement that they couldn't just read alone; they had to read with each other, etc. And so then I had this hysterical. He was from California, and I mean, he really made my teaching experience. So I'm not trying to belittle it at all. And he just came and he said, "Professor, dude, I just got to tell you, it was amazing. I got myself a case of beer." And I mean, I sat on my bed and I thought. And I had such a hard time laughing at that and being encouraging. But what really struck me is that, especially also with education, our education is so memory based, or we're so, I think that. I thought it was very tedious in my youth, of course, when I heard other people. But there is such a joy and a delight in awakening the mind to, the fullness of reality. And I think there's much value in that. And again, I think that personal contact with a professor, or that personal dialogue, I mean, it's been so inspiring to see how people have gotten together. And I think that engagement, so not just that personal witness, but that engagement of you know, this is even just a new word, or this is a new concept. You know, I think that a lot can be done on that level, and would be very enriching. And I think that Hildebrand really gave us great tools, especially I think for our time, because they're very important things that he talks about, and that he makes many distinctions within. So yes, Chase.
I guess I would just suggest like that there are a lot of points of what a witness to chastity needs to contain, and I know Jason Everett was already brought up, but chastity.com is run by Jason Everett, who's actually a graduate of Franciscan University, and it's an amazing fusion of the scientific evidence, appeal to beauty, speaking to people's actual experience, but also giving them intimations of philosophical underpinnings. So I would just point people there as a resource because it's so systematic, and there's thorough references to scientific studies that statistically show like the effects of these things biologically, and also case studies of what happens to people in these situations.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
What's the website again, please?
Chastity.com.
But that's going to be obsolete here soon. They're going to come out with a new one in the next few months. But it's still up. You can still go to it.
All right, let's see. One more hand. Yes.
I was just going to say well, this is, I guess, my personal experience of talking to people. They don't want to think anymore. Like, I just had a discussion with a couple friends the other day who are practicing Catholics, my friends, I was shocked that they all had just sort of accepted gay marriage and said, well, and I talked them through different arguments, and it seems like to me that like the instant gratification culture has seeped into thought and even like philosophy, like personal, and that like they don't even think about the long-term argument. They don't want to think about long-term arguments anymore, and they'll say like, oh, well, nobody's really shown me an argument but they don't even think about the argument, and they just sort of think about what's going to make me feel good right now, which like position, politically or intellectually, is going to make me feel good right now, and that's the one I'm going to take. And if I need to change it later, then I'll just change it, and it's fine. And that's maybe why the only thing that seems to be sort of consistent with people anymore is their personal experience and their self. I think you have to maintain like some sort of consistency with that, hopefully. And so then speaking to that, if you can connect with, that's why I think the value of this like personalist approach. If you can connect something with their personal experience or like desire to be a consistent person, and it almost seems to be like an instant gratification of thought.
Which Google has helped a lot. This is an article on because Google is the instantiation of the instant gratification of thought, right? Of reducing wisdom to knowledge, and actually not just knowledge but information, etc. They actually had an article on Google about that. But perhaps also just as so. Hence, I think, and this is why I too love the personalist approach, because I do think, for that reason, that it is the most powerful approach, I think, nowadays. But perhaps also just very, very quickly to say, maybe, one of the problems that we have is that we try to tackle the difficult, that very often we try to tackle these negative issues first, when we're trying to awaken people to thought. That if we sometimes we're so confined to the areas that, where people have lived this, or where it really is a difficult moral issue. But I mean, if we could somehow begin small and build up, with delightful things like value, or good, or, starting there, and then the natural process to other things will begin. Because I do find that we're sometimes, and unfortunately that's just, I think, simply the way it is, that we're confronted with these horrible realities and harsh realities, and then we find ourselves having to engage always only about them. Yeah, and really that if we started on a different level, that would be helpful as well. So I have 2 more hands. Oh dear. Okay, and then but really we're stopping at 11:30 punctually. Yes, Maria.
One more, patience.
Patience.
So intriguing that the one that will be understood.
Yes, patience. Oh, it's very difficult. Yes.
I would say that the kind of, again, the beauty of the personalist approach, especially in this conversation, can definitely be found again in Hildebrand's discussion of the heart, given what you're saying about people not wanting to think, and we kind of live in an emotive culture, and so it's not necessarily, delight and beauty for the sake of the example, for the sake of themselves, for the sake of just the experience, but beauty, like appealing to the example of the level of beauty that can be achieved in a rightly ordered marital love relationship for the sake of awakening thighs, for the sake of the truth that you can then begin to pour into them once you've kind of hooked their mind through their experience of their heart, and making bringing in the whole idea of like spiritual affectivity and intentional forget the language, the intentional feelings could be a door into the more philosophical rational. But I do think that the personalist approach has a very beautiful and unique opportunity, like I said, especially in regard to Hildebrand's discussion of the heart and discussion of delight, affectivity, not just being in regard to knowing and doing, but in delighting. And there can be a delight in the rational, but that might have to, it might have to be through the beauty, the more intuitive, emotive experiences that awakening could happen.
I see that tonight's discussion, or whenever the discussion on beauty will happen, it's resonated deeply with many hearts. So this is wonderful. So, ladies and gentlemen, thank you for the discussion and this was great to really discuss and delve into the text together. I very much enjoyed that.